welcome to our LACRA Town Hall. We're going to be talking about the Legislative and Congressional Redistricting Act, House Bill 2638 and Senate Bill 1242. And we are looking forward to talking about that. Fair Districts PA is working with lots of partners on this project, and we're happy to have representatives of some of them here. David Thornburgh from Committee of 70. We have a team from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. We also have quite a few people who are joining us today from the League of Women Voters. This is part of the training for the People-Powered Fair Maps initiative that is just kicking off for the new year to be pushing for reform to our Pennsylvania redistricting process. So as many of you know, we supported some bills in the last session. Well, up through the summer, we supported 2 bills to change, actually 4 bills, 2 in the House, 2 in the Senate, to put an independent commission in place. We're very aware that we've run out of time on that. We were hoping that Senator Tom Killian would be with us right now to explain why he is prime sponsor of the Senate bill. And we hope that Representative Wendi Thomas will be joining us to explain her interest in this as well. But we know it's a legislative day for Representative Thomas, so she is not certain that she can be with us. And we know also that Senator Killian has someplace he has to be this evening. He was going to try to join us right at the beginning, but that might not be possible. What we're going to do is, this is a webinar. We have a lot of people who signed up to be with us. I don't know if all of them will make it, but we certainly hope that we'll have lots. And we're going to present information about the bill in both houses. Pat Beaty is going to explain it. He's the one who drafted it with input and thoughts and advice from lots of different directions, including those from the other organizations who are here. Aaron and David both were offered thoughts and input, as well as quite a few other people. But Pat did a lot of work in pulling together what looks like best practices from around the country. What we hope this will be a really important addition to the conversation about how do you create fair maps. Our first goal was to be the first state that doesn't have citizen initiative, that got an independent commission in place. Looks like that's not going to be our contribution to this conversation. Our next goal is that we would have a really strong criteria and public engagement and transparency bill, and let that be a model for other states around the country. We know there are lots of states who are watching the work we're doing here, who know that they have gerrymandering, perhaps not as egregious as ours, but there are plenty of states that are looking for ways to address that. And so we're excited about this new bill. We've got a short timeline, but we have lots of interest, and we're hoping to get it done. So I'm going to turn this over to Pat Beaty, and we're going to go ahead and talk about the bill.
Well, welcome everyone. It's a really good turnout for this seminar or this presentation, and I hope you're going to get a lot of information from it. So I'm going to pick up where Carol left off, which is that, we had a couple of bills that we were trying to get enacted. We have run out of time for that, for an independent commission for redistricting, for both the legislative and for the congressional redistricting. So that's no longer an option, no longer possible. The deadline for a constitutional amendment has passed, and there's really no time left to put in place a congressional commission either. So it's still possible for the legislature to pass those bills, but there really isn't enough time to put them into effect. So with that as the reality, we have moved on. We're disappointed, obviously, but we believe that there really are other ways to reform the process without an independent commission. An independent commission is considered the gold standard, but there are lots of other things that we can do to make the process much more responsive, much more transparent, and having criteria that really do make it more difficult to have some of the more egregious gerrymandering that we've seen in Pennsylvania in the past and in other states as well. So House Bill 2638 was introduced by Representative Wendi Thomas at the end of the session just before the summer break, and went to the House State Government Committee. An identical bill, Senate Bill 1242, was introduced in the Senate by Senator Tom Killian. on July 20th. So, and the idea behind the bill, which we are calling LACRA, the Legislative and Congressional Redistricting Act, is that while legislators' roles in the process will remain unchanged, we can still have a lot of rules that make it harder for them to engage in partisan gerrymandering, and guidelines for courts to test whether maps are fair. So how does LACRA ensure a more fair redistricting process? First, by introducing much more transparency into the process with multiple public hearings and opportunities for the public to be engaged. By imposing specific, clear, measurable map drawing criteria in place of the few very vague standards that now exist. By explicitly prohibiting partisan and racial gerrymandering, and by promoting greater accountability. So again, LACRA does not change the current roles of the General Assembly in redistricting the legislature or congressional seats, but instead it would build upon and improve those existing processes while also limiting the potential for extreme gerrymandering. The bills add qualifications for the chairman of the Legislative Reapportionment Commission. Right now, the commission chair is either chosen by the other four members, which hardly ever happens, or is picked by the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court. And the only requirement is that that person be a citizen and not be a public official. So we would add a number of other qualifications in this bill. For example, no lobbyists, no party operatives, nor their spouses. So a lot of people that we certainly would hope would be disqualified, and which also, by the way, would have been disqualified from our independent commission, would now be disqualified to be the chair of the Legislative Reapportionment Commission. That the chairperson would also be subject to Pennsylvania law that applies to financial disclosure and conflicts of interest. The bills also expand the role of an existing arm of the General Assembly, which is the Legislative Data Processing Committee, and that is a body that is made up of the leadership of the legislature, and it oversees the Legislative Data Processing Center. The Legislative Data Processing Center has had an existing role in redistricting for a long time, and they would continue to have that role, but we would expand the functions of that committee and the Data Processing Center to do some other things that are very important. Probably most significant is they would be responsible for maintaining a user-friendly website for dissemination of data, maps, analyses of maps, public comments, and other information that would be, all of which would be free of charge to the public. So that the Data Processing Center would maintain that website for both types of redistricting. LACRA also allows any Pennsylvania resident to submit a proposed map for any or all legislative or congressional districts or parts of districts. And any maps and public comments that come in through the website must be given consideration equal to testimony presented at public hearings. The bills also provide for multiple statewide public hearings, which would be required both before and after the preliminary redistricting plans are approved. This is really a key provision because it provides an opportunity for members of the public to present testimony and information on what they believe to be important communities of interest that should be addressed in the preliminary plan before it's even produced. And then, of course, which should be addressed in the final plan as well. The bills require that final maps have to be published on the website at least 7 days before they are voted on. So this gives the public and mapping experts the opportunity to point out flaws in the proposals before the final vote. So as far as the criteria, that what I just went through is most of the provisions dealing with transparency and engagement of the public. So now moving into the criteria. Under the current law, there are very few criteria that the legislature or the Legislative Reapportionment Commission have to follow in drawing district lines. There is really nothing much more than what's in the Constitution that most of us, I think, are familiar with, which is requirements that districts be compact, that they be contiguous, and that they not divide political subdivisions unless absolutely necessary. So that's the provision that's in the Constitution for legislative districts. Our state Supreme Court adopted those criteria in the court case that applied to congressional redistricting. So they do apply to that as well now as a result of court decision. But there isn't a lot of specificity around those criteria. And as we know, they've been in law for quite a long time, and we still have had some pretty bad gerrymandering that has occurred. So what LACRA would do is provide some additional enforceable limits on splitting of counties beyond what is required by their population. So these are the same restrictions that were in our other bills. So a county could not contain more senatorial or congressional districts than the number required by the county population +1, and no more House districts than the population requires +2. And those are similar to what we've had in our bills for the last few years. In addition, as recommended by the Governor's Redistricting Reform Commission, the LACRA bills also include an explicit prohibition against dividing voting precincts. Also, racial and language minorities would be protected against discrimination in the mapping process. And that would be in addition to any protection that they may have under the Voting Rights Act. LACRA also explicitly prohibits district plans that are designed to protect incumbents or to unfairly discriminate against political parties. So we would have in law for the first time an explicit prohibition against the kind of extreme partisan gerrymandering that we've seen, unfortunately, too often in the past. That then, of course, provides a guideline for the courts to determine whether or not a plan that goes too far and unfairly discriminates against an incumbent or a candidate or a party. So the previous slides, which I don't know whether you're seeing the slides or not, but what I've just discussed identifies what we would call primary rules that apply to all future district maps. But LACRA also includes 3 additional, what we might call secondary mapping criteria. So these would be applied to the extent that they can be without violating the other criteria. So redistricting plans would also be required to keep communities of interest intact, to be responsive to voter preferences as measured by widely accepted tests, and conform district boundaries to natural boundaries like rivers and mountains. So, and the bills contain definitions of those terms: community of interest, which, by the way, cannot include political affiliation. That's not a community of interest. And there are other limitations on what that term entails. And also a definition of what does it mean when we say that a map is responsive. And those things, I believe, will be further explained by our panel from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. So one more thing I want to say about the bills before we move on to the next panelist, and that is with regard to timing. So we are very hopeful that the General Assembly will take this bill up, or these bills, and enact them before November or by November, when they adjourn this 2-year session. And there is still some time. They only have 10 scheduled days. There's time for them to act within those 10 scheduled days, or they can also add days, which they may very well do, to deal with some other issues. But there's still time if they don't even get that done, so that the bills could be reintroduced in 2021 and can still be enacted, but let's say by the middle of next year, and be implemented in time to have an effect on the 2021 redistricting. There are some things that may have to change in the bills. We may have to amend them slightly to deal with some of our timeline that we have in there, or some of the requirements that by the time, let's say, the chairman has been appointed, it's no longer possible to impose requirements on his or her qualifications. So those things may have to be revised, but by and large, this bill can be enacted intact by the middle of next year and still be implemented and have an effect on the 2021 redistricting. I mean, the last time in 2011, 2012, the Reapportionment Commission didn't even produce their preliminary plan until the end of October of 2011. And the congressional map was not even introduced with any substance until December of 2011. So there is time, again, for us to catch up, if you will, for the legislature to still pass this reform next year, if that's what it takes, if we don't get it done by the end of this term. Now,
I'm going to jump in for just a moment. Pat is going to introduce David Thornburgh, but before he does, I just want to give you a heads up on how we're going to do questions, because I know some of you already have questions. If you look for the little question and answer icon in your Zoom toolbar, you can ask questions. If it's directed to a particular person, just put their name first. So if there's something that Pat said that you want to hear more about, just say Pat, then ask the question. You can look at those questions and thumbs up questions that are of specific interest to you, and the questions that get the most thumbs up will be the ones that get answered first when we get to our Q&A time. So go ahead and ask questions, go ahead and thumbs up questions as we go along. Top questions will be answered and address them to a specific speaker. And now I'm gonna let Pat go ahead and introduce David Thornburgh. We're gonna stop the screen share, and David will talk to us as well. Thank you, Pat.
Okay, so our next panelist is David Thornburgh, who is the president of the, I believe that's the right title, Committee of 70, a long-standing reform organization, government reform organization based in Philadelphia. He also was the chair of the Governor's Redistricting Reform Commission, which produced a report which also informed some of our LACRA proposal. So David, please take it away.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Pat. For those of you who haven't seen it before, I'm coming to you from in front of the Volkswagen, which has become sort of the official mascot or company car of the Committee of 70. And you'll see two important messages there. One is make my vote count, which not just in this election, but I think in all elections really underscores one of the critical messages of why gerrymandering and map drawing is so important. And then on the front driver's seat, door, you can see Draw the Lines PA, which I suspect a number of you are familiar with, but I will talk to you about a little bit later. I'm delighted to be with you folks, and pleased and astounded to see that there are hundreds of people out in Pennsylvania who are still on this issue and still willing to dig in and to do what we can to make for better maps this time around. Carol and Pat asked me to talk a little bit about the experience of the Reform Commission and a couple observations about LACRA, and maybe how all of this relates to the Draw the Lines project as well, which has been sort of our signature contribution to this effort. So first things first, I was just thinking that this is an appropriate date for me to talk about the Reform Commission, because literally 1 year ago tomorrow, we released our report. So if I rewound back to Wednesday before Labor Day weekend, 2019, I and a bunch of others were furiously working away on the last version of the draft and making sure that we crossed the T's and dotted the I's and had the references down, the footnotes and the appendices. And I'm sure a lot of you have been through that drill, but we are very proud of that effort, and particularly proud that so many folks from around Pennsylvania shared their thoughts with us about how they thought this process of drawing maps should unwind. And I suspect a number of you, among the few hundred that are on the call, came out to talk to us. Throughout the process, we had 9 public meetings across the Commonwealth. I like to remind folks that we were only required to do 6, but we in fact held 9 because we wanted to make sure that we reached deep into all corners of Pennsylvania. And in some ways, and this is sort of a preview of a comment about LACRA, we were trying to preview or maybe set a model for the kind of public engagement that ought to take place around this process, which, as Pat pointed out, has been more noticed in its absence in the past. But we're at a point of time where we have the tools and the willingness and the capability to contribute to this process. So one comment about, again, this may be familiar to those who came out to talk to us. We tried to organize people's thinking and comments when we hit the road, whether in Altoona or Northampton Community College or Erie or wherever else we were. We asked for folks' comments around 3 particular types of issues. You could call it a framework, I suppose, which I'll credit Amanda Holt. Some of you know Amanda is sort of the patron saint of citizen map drawing and star of the 2011 Supreme Court decision. But Amanda introduced this concept, which I think is a really useful one. And she said, look, there are 3 sources of power or checks on the map drawing process. There's the who, the what, and the how. Who, what, and how. And let me just say a little bit about each one, because I think it's very relevant to this discussion. The who gets a lot of attention, right? That's who literally is drawing or approving or editing or proposing the maps. And when we say, you know, we don't want, you know, voters not politicians, or, you know, the fox guarding the hen house or whatever, we're really talking about the who. And that gets a lot of attention because I think it's very easy to understand. You see who the people are, and, you know, as long as the commission conversation was alive, we said, well, we don't want people who have a direct interest in the outcome of the maps. Having said that, you know, the what, I became convinced, was equally, if not more important. And the what I would define as the rules by which you draw the maps. In other words, criteria. And Pat talked about some of the criteria that are in the LACRA proposal. But when we were out on the trail, and I had a little bit of a disagreement with Amanda Holt, who was one of the commissioners. And I said at one point, well, Amanda, you know, most people really want to just talk about the who. And she said, and she's a stickler for those of you who know her, she said, no. She said, what I heard was a lot of people wanting to talk about the rules, the criteria, the guardrails, the constraints by which the maps could be drawn. So I was convinced by that. And if you read the commission report, which I would recommend to you as a refresher for the upcoming season, it reflects that. There really was a lot of consideration about what those rules should be. And I'll second that by saying, talking a little bit about the Draw the Lines project, which we, with somewhat tongue-in-cheek, said is the largest citizen map drawing competition in the history of the United States. Now, there haven't been a whole lot of them, but we were able to engage to date, and by the way, this is ongoing, about 6,000 Pennsylvanians to take up the task of drawing their own congressional and legislative maps. And in doing that, we said, look, you can't draw a map unless you come to some conclusions about what? The criteria by which you draw maps. So we put people through that drill, whether it's compactness, equal population, contiguity, minority representation, whatever. So that gave us confidence that people, as we like to say, are ready, willing, and able to enter into that conversation, that these are meaningful conversations that are not foreign to interested citizens in Pennsylvania. So there's the who, the what, and the how is a simple way of talking about the transparency in the public process that Pat talked about earlier. That given particularly the tools that we have at our disposal now, this thing called Zoom that we're now experiencing, we have an unprecedented and historic opportunity to be transparent about all aspects of this process, and that there's considerable power in that. And we don't have to rely on just a couple of reporters who show up for things, or some whisper down the lane sense of what went on at a particular meeting. That there's an ability to broadcast these kinds of proceedings and involve and engage people in a way that we've never had before. So I want to say all that just because it tried to capture some of the essence of the conversations we have, but also to reassure you, at least from my perspective, that there's considerable power in this LACRA legislation, which does rely on the what and the how. So as Pat said, there's a practical reality at work. The time has come and gone where we could stand up an independent commission. So the who is pretty much off the table, but there's a considerable amount of power in the what and the how. And we're firmly convinced that that the kind of safeguards and criteria and process steps that are stipulated in this legislation can continue to make a real difference. And I commend Carol and Pat for having been. It's not always easy to pivot. It's easy to say the word, but it's not easy to do. But I commend you folks for being resourceful and creative and understanding the power as drafted in legislation that the what and the how bring to this conversation. And let me just close by saying something about our plans for Draw the Lines. Again, I saw a couple of names on there that I know are stalwarts of the Draw the Lines competition. We actually just closed the last, or the most recent competition the other day. And I know Justin Villery, who some of you know is on the line here. And we've got a bunch of good maps from that competition from all over the Commonwealth. And we'll be going through a judging process with our steering committees that also involve some of you to identify those maps that really stand out. Not just in their, we always thought about this as like an application process to, college or university or for a job for that matter. There's the technical qualities, but then we wanted to know the story behind the map, that what it is that people identified as the values that they cared about, that they tried to exemplify in the map, which at the end of the day is what this is all about. I mean, the metrics that we'll hear about from the Princeton folks are really important, but only as a way to specify the stuff that we care about. And it's the stuff that we care about that we have to keep an eye on. So Draw the Lines is very much alive and well. We are in the process of thinking through our kind of last lap around the track strategy, and it's very, very consistent with LACRA and this emphasis on the what and the how. What we've said is what we have to concentrate on now is getting the best possible maps that we can out of this process. So put aside everything else. We're going to focus on the maps and focus on everything that we can do to make sure that we end up with great maps that adequately represent the interests of the people of the Commonwealth. And in doing that, and this is a little bit of a sneak preview, and again, some of you on the call know this, we have kind of recruited from among the ranks of 6,000 of our best, 6,000 of our mappers, kind of an elite crew of what we're calling the Citizen Map Corps, which probably will end up being about 75 people, again, from across the Commonwealth, who really dug into this process and showed themselves not only technically proficient, but also to have the passion and the enthusiasm and the communication skills to sort of carry the message forward. And we're working with a firm out of Pittsburgh, Denny Civic Solutions, that some of you may know, to help us deploy those citizen mappers and that map corps in the months to come. In support of LACRA, but largely and in a larger sense, in support of making sure that we end up with great maps. And I'll just close by going back to what I said earlier. We're at a time in the history of this country where the technology, the software is readily available, whether it's the district builder software that we use or Dave's or whatever the Princeton folks have cooked up their sleeves. So the tool that if you read Dave Daly's book about gerrymandering, you'll see how in that case, even in 2011, the technology to draw maps was weaponized. And that's no longer the case. We've democratized it. We've said everybody can do this. And it may be easy to dismiss that, but what we're betting on is that in conjunction with LACRA, we've got thousands of people around the Commonwealth who can take up this task and demonstrate to their own legislators and to the media and to legislative leadership and the larger community that Pennsylvanians want to have a say in this. So we've talked about this summer as being sort of like the summer of Valley Forge. This is a time to regroup and recommit and to up our game and to get ready for this enormous but winnable challenge that we have in front of us. And I'll close by just again commending the folks, Carol and Pat, and all of your legion of troops for hanging in there, for re-enlisting and showing your willingness to continue the fight. So I'll end there and look forward to the rest of the presentation and be glad to answer questions on the back end.
Thank you, David. And I am, one of the things I love about this, the work we're doing is there's so many different kinds of people engaging at so many different levels, drawing maps or speaking or calling legislators, talking to neighbors, writing postcards, all kinds of different skills and abilities are brought to bear on this grassroots effort to change the way our maps are drawn and to change the way our legislature operates. I mean, it's not just about maps, it's what comes after the maps. It's what the maps give us or deny us. And our goal is to have a responsive legislature that actually accomplishes the things that we want. So I'm really happy to introduce some other folks who are coming at this from a different angle than my normal angle. So our Princeton Gerrymandering friends have a number of different skills that they bring together as a team. And as I said, Aaron Barden helped weigh in a little bit to look at what other states were doing and to offer insight into that. Hope Johnson and Baxter Demers are looking at different kinds of metrics in the way that this plays out. So they're going to take the next 20 minutes or so to kind of talk about mapping metrics and what they see in the landscape of redistricting reform. So thank you to them, and they'll go ahead and let me just remind you before I turn it over, ask questions in the Q&A and go there and thumbs up those that you particularly want to hear answers to. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of your questions today. Some of them I will answer on the conference call tomorrow, my regular conference call. Some of them we will be deferring to a more in the weeds meeting on metrics and mapping in 2 weeks. But some of them we will answer today. So thumbs up those that you would love to see answered today, and we'll do as many as we can. So thank you, Aaron, it's to you.
All right, thanks, Carol. And Yeah, very excited to speak about LACRA today. And I have with me Hope Johnson and Baxter Demers, two of our data analysts, I think are their titles. And I'm the legal and policy analyst for the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And let me share my screen with you all so you can see our slides. I hope. All right, full screen. All right. So as I said, we are with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, and I just want to talk to you guys about the criteria real quick. So I'm going to kind of breeze through a lot of this because Pat actually spoke about it at the beginning of the call, but I just want to reiterate that LACRA has kind of two tiers of criteria. And the first tier are the following: that it must, district plans have to protect communities of color, and that's whether these communities are alone or in coalition with others. So this actually expands upon the Federal Voting Rights Act requirement, which only looks at minority communities as like the Black community or the Latino community, and this allows for coalition districts, which will help communities of color band together to elect candidates of choice. Second is that LACRA requires some pretty clear county splitting rules. I know that this was an issue in previous Pennsylvania redistricting cases, and you can read those rules right there. And then the third rule is that it doesn't, plans can't divide precincts. And a big benefit of this is for election administration to make sure that when you go to a polling place, you know what district you're in, and there's not that confusion about the poll worker asking which district are you in, and then ballots get mixed up and things like that. And then for congressional only, it adds what's already in the state constitution for state legislative districts. So congressional districts must be compact, contiguous, and only split municipalities when absolutely necessary. And then once those are all met, to the extent possible and in the following order of priority, a map must follow the following. It has to keep communities of interest intact, and I will expand on what that means in just a second. Plans have to be responsive, which Baxter will talk about after me. And then they also have to conform to natural boundaries. So like, let's say the Delaware River or something like that. And so those things come after the first tier criteria. And then there's also some prohibited criteria, which is the partisan gerrymandering bit, where plans cannot purposely or unduly favor or disfavor incumbents, candidates, prospective candidates, or a political party on a statewide basis. And that last piece about statewide basis is where the partisan fairness metrics come in, and Hope will speak about that a little bit. So I just want to talk about the communities of interest real quick. Generally speaking, a community of interest is a group of Pennsylvanians who share interests that might be the subject of legislation. More specifically, LACRA defines a community of interest as a neighborhood or a geographically confined area of persons who share similar social, cultural, economic, or other shared interests that may be subject to legislative action. And importantly, a community of interest, as Pat mentioned earlier, does not include a shared relationship with a party incumbent or political candidate. This type of community of interest language is quite common among reform proposals. Other states that either have it in had it in proposals or have it now as law are Colorado, Michigan, Nevada, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Oregon, and Virginia. A number of those are unfortunately ballot initiatives that due to COVID won't be on the ballot this year, but we hope to see in the future. But this language is very common, and it's often recommended by places like the Brennan Center, Common Cause, League of Women Voters, and all those kinds of good government groups. And those good government groups have all agreed that having a community of interest provision is essential to making sure that maps are representative. For example, municipalities don't always line up with communities. That's actually something that Speaker Mike Turzai mentioned in a law article that he wrote. that sometimes communities can cross over municipality boundaries. Like, for example, there's Native American tribes, or the Amish community may cross over county boundaries, or school districts might cross over municipal boundaries and things of that nature. And then also smaller communities could be split without a community of interest protection. So let's say in order to comply with population requirements, you have to split Philadelphia in half, which is probably likely. A community of interest provision prevents the line that splits Philadelphia from going through a smaller minority community. I think Common Cause Pennsylvania gave the example of a Latino community in Philadelphia. So rather than splitting that community in half, a community of interest provision would move that line over so that community remains whole. Now I know that community of interests have been slightly controversial in Pennsylvania, and there have been alleged instances of communities of interest being used for partisan reasons, but LACRA guards against these things because of its clear community of interest definition, the fact that it's a second tier criterion that you have to comply with after doing other things, and the robust public input within LACRA will really help there, especially if you use community of interest mapping tools like District R, which is created by the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group, and Representable, which is created by a group of Princeton undergrads. Representable in particular has like an aggregate mapping view where you can see communities layered on top of each other that have been drawn by citizens. So you can kind of see through where those communities coalesce, where a community actually is, and see the outliers that might be attempts at sabotage or something like that. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Baxter to talk about responsiveness.
Thanks, Aaron. So when we're considering responsiveness, it's important to keep in mind the difference between the criterion of having a responsive map and responsiveness, which is one way to measure the degree to which a map is responsive. And I just want to echo what David said earlier about finding what qualities you all want to include in a map criterion, and then figuring out which kind of concrete numbers represent that. So I think that's a really important point to keep in mind throughout this discussion of metrics. So a responsive map means that as voters' preferences change, specifically the vote share that a party gets, there's a corresponding change in their representation, the seat share. So let's go to the next slide. One observation that you can think about to kind of get bounds on how responsiveness works is, as the number of districts approaches the number of citizens that can vote, this starts to resemble an electoral system which we know as direct democracy. Conversely, as the number of districts approaches 1, for example, for a US Senate race, we have a winner-take-all electoral system. And then somewhere in the middle, there's this single-member district breakdown that we have for congressional districts and for Pennsylvania's upper and lower chamber. And in this case, we're somewhere in between a winner-take-all system and direct democracy. And the question is, to what extent do we want to have the change in votes translate into outcome in terms of actual representation? So if we take a look at this graphic on screen, this is a graph showing a scatter plot of, on the x-axis, we have two-party vote share, which is, of course, representing voters' preferences with respect to partisanship. And then on the y-axis, we have representation. This graph is known as the seats votes graph or seats votes curve. And it's going to be super useful for responsiveness, measuring responsiveness, and Hope is also going to touch on how it can be used to look at things like partisan asymmetry. So generally, we can think of responsiveness as the slope of this graph. Specifically, it's most akin to the responsiveness when we take the slope at the point on the x-axis that corresponds with the actual number of votes for a particular party. So for example, if the Democratic vote share that we are expecting is 60%, we should take the slope at where the x is equal to 60%. So what can all these slopes or things mean? Let's take a look at the next slide to think about that. So one academic is named Gary King. He's pretty well known in the political science literature. And he comes up with kind of classifications for these different slopes. And again, I want to bring it back to what David said. We should first think about which label we want to apply. So if we want an electoral system that is more proportional or more majoritarian, and then from there pick some range of numbers that are acceptable, rather than just trying to max out the number, in which case if you maximize responsiveness, we have a winner take all system like a Senate district. So just to quickly go through it, in a majoritarian system, the winner is given some degree of a bonus. Like in the case of a legislature, if a party wins a majority of the vote, they are rewarded with more than a majority of the seats. And this could be good if you want if you want a system that kind of does give spoils to the winner. But it's definitely something you want to think about outside of the context of just numbers. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Hope, and she's going to talk a bit about another way to quantify how a map looks, which is partisan fairness.
Great. So thanks for that, Baxter and Aaron and all the other panelists. So there are a number of ways that gerrymandering can be quantified, and these are known as sort of partisan fairness metrics. And I listed on the screen 5 different ones that can be applied to a state using the election results from each district. And then sort of we have this whole array of numbers that are spit out that can quantify gerrymandering. And I think I'm going to go through this quickly because I believe in a few weeks we're going to have more of a deep dive to get in the weeds about these metrics and how they're sort of created. So just quickly, it's important to mention that all of these metrics have strengths and weaknesses, and they're all sort of looking at the problem of gerrymandering from different angles. And so like the first one that I listed, mean median difference, can be used to detect packing and cracking. But at the same time, the mean median difference has a weakness because it's really sensitive to the vote share in a single district. Because part of the metric is created by taking an average, if there's one district that's like super duper Democratic and the rest of the state is fairly, Republican leaning, then that's going to kind of throw it off. So that's sort of that's kind of to illustrate that all of them have shortcomings, and it's important to be aware of the pluses and minuses when you're deciding which metric to use. Some of the metrics require assumptions about statistical significance. That's the lopsided wins metric. Some require a really large number of districts to give reliable results. So that includes the efficiency gap and lopsided wins as well. And then some are really not suited for states where one party reliably wins. And that includes the declination. So like I said, I want to go more into this topic and kind of explain the way that these metrics are created later on. But just for now, know that there's not really one silver bullet metric that will kind of explain perfectly whether or not a map is fair, but it's really just using these fairness metrics as a toolkit and applying them in different ways when you really know kind of the political landscape of a state. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it there.
Cool. And then since part of what PGP does is related to data transparency, I did just want to have a little bit of discussion of LACRA's public input and transparency. I'm not going to read this whole slide, don't worry. I just wanted to clearly show what like LACRA's public input and transparency requirements are. I think someone in the chat asked whether there would be hearings after maps are released. Yes, there will. For legislative maps, there's 2 to hear exceptions, which is within the state constitution. And then there are 4 after the congressional map is released. And then there are all of these other ones about open meeting laws and live streamed and archived hearings. But what we think is very important is the data transparency provisions at the end of the bill, which gives a huge list of all of the things that have to be published on the LDPC website that they create. So all data used by the redistricting authorities in formats easily usable for analysis, preliminary, final, and citizen submitted plans, transcripts of testimony, reports about changes between preliminary and final plans, how those plans complied with criteria, and how they incorporated public input, and then precinct and block equivalency files, which gets to something that we want to touch on at the end here. So just real quick, I want to talk about how these things will make LACRA a success. As I said before, the robust public input is definitely critical to ensuring that the community of interest criterion is successful. Allowing the public to submit alternative maps will show that a better map may be possible using the same exact criteria. Remote access to public hearings will facilitate broader engagement in a state as large as Pennsylvania. Publishing this large amount of data will ensure that public analysis of the maps by people like us or just regular citizens will be accurate, informed, and helpful to the redistricting authorities. And then just lastly, we know the current landscape of Pennsylvania's election and precinct data, which like a number of other states is pretty difficult to work with. And I just wanted to show really quickly what can happen with inaccurate precinct data. So there is I don't know if you guys have seen it, there's a New York Times graphic that's like, shows the entire United States with all of the precincts, and it basically asks, do you live in a political bubble? And basically what we found, and Hope or Baxter, if you want to hop in if I say anything wrong, is that the precinct map in that graphic is pretty incorrect. As you can see here, this is Manassas Park, Virginia, my home state, woohoo. And as you can see, the precincts are wrong, just pretty clearly incorrect. So by having a requirement that the precincts get released, LACRA will ensure that the data that is available in Pennsylvania looks more like the right than the left, so that it is the correct precinct rather than something that is very incorrect. And this is where I think Hope and Baxter will come in. I don't think we're going to read this entire slide, but this is how we collect precinct data currently. If one of y'all want to hop in.
I can go. Yeah, so I'm actually in the process of assembling precinct data for Pennsylvania. So I have firsthand experience with the difficulties of assembling accurate precinct data. And part of this bill will hopefully improve the process in the future for future redistricting cycles. So for just a quick example, before we get into it, a lot of the times counties will use different names for their precincts on their maps and the precincts in the election results, which leads to some confusion that results in needing to contact the county election board officials, which can take quite some time. So I've been working on this project for a few months, and this data is, of course, all necessary to project how a novel redistricting plan will affect partisan representation, how it will affect responsiveness, and all these metrics we talked about. So this data is essential for projecting how well a proposed redistricting plan will conform to the criteria that's laid out here in LACRA. And with that, I think we're going to switch up to Q&A. Is that right, Carol?
We have one more slide.
Oh, one more slide. I'm sorry, my bad.
It's just to show what the beautiful final product is on openprecincts.org, which is where we put all of our data. And now we're done, and we can pass it back to Carol.
Great. So thank you. I'm excited that we have Representative Wendi Thomas has joined us. She was in session, so it's taken some time for her to get free to join us. I'm trying to cancel screen share. I'm hoping that I'm in the right place. We're still learning how to do all this. Anyhow, Representative Wendi Thomas is with us. She has been a strong supporter of our work since we started. Well, since she was elected. She was in office when we started, but she came into office in 2019, and she was an early co-sponsor of House Bills 22 and 23. And when we realized we needed to move in a new direction, we reached out to her. She was the first person we asked, and she said yes quickly. So we're really excited that she is taking the lead on House Bill 2638. I'd love to just have her say a few words about why she's supporting this and some of her own experience with communities of interest in a very different context, but that gives her some idea of the kind of challenges that we have that we're looking at. So thank you so much, Representative Thomas, for joining us on a very busy day.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me disrupt your agenda a little bit. So I do apologize. It's been a crazy few days in Harrisburg. Not that it isn't always, but yes, I am a proud sponsor. I do really feel attached to the transparency part of this bill, and unintentionally, just in a radio interview, it came up. I think what Carol's referring to is I previously was on a school board for 10 years. We had about between 10 and 12,000 students. But when I started, we had about 12,000. And as we got to 10, we were looking at redistricting, more efficient use of buildings. So we had to redraw maps. And our community, literally sat around kitchen tables drawing maps. Some people used computer systems, not nearly to the sophisticated. I see the Draw the Lines van, I guess, in the background there, but maybe not as sophisticated as where we are today, because we're going back now, I don't know the exact date, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And my personal experience was, yes, we hired professionals and we were on the school board. So of course there's a tendency to listen to those people. But what we learned from the maps that I think is critical, and I think that is vital in this environment, is you can look at a map and say, oh, my own neighborhood is 3 streets, but when they build it, there's a 4th separate street that's not connected to us that somebody would never know we think of as part of our neighborhood. But I live there. I know we think of it as our neighborhood. I know the kids all play together. So that was the great input we got by having such great community involvement. Now, I fully understand we're talking about 3 townships and 10,000 people, not the state of Pennsylvania, which is a much bigger task. But I do think the value of the bill you know, and the public input is, you might look at a street and you might not recognize a community as being considered, they consider they're together, but you might get that input. And well, I actually got asked on the radio program, I don't know how the process will go, that they would just say, oh, Joe Smith submitted an app, that's going to be the whole state. It's more that you learn pieces from each of the different people that submit, and that makes your final product better. And that's my hope for the bill. And that was my experience on the school board. It's challenging because it doesn't make everybody happy, but actually the combined information was better than the isolated information alone. So that's my interest. That's kind of my experience, my background. I've spoken at several townships in support of this. I have spoken to leadership. I spoke to the chair of the committee about my bill while I was up here today. Now I will tell you, his committee was handling some reforms that the counties had asked us in regards to mail-in ballots to do. So he has been underwater with that, but he has committed to talk to me about it next week. So I will work my hardest to move this forward. I appreciate all of your hard work and your support. I know this has been years of work for many of you. And I'm a newer to the game since I only got here in 19. But I'm more than willing to speak about it. I'm more than willing to champion the cause, and I will do my best to move it forward.
Well, thank you so very much for joining us. I know it was a busy day and a challenge to get here, and thank you so very much for talking to your committee, the committee chair of the House State Government Committee, and we look forward to you talking with him further about your bill. Thank you so much for being the prime sponsor for it. I'm going to tackle a few quick questions, and while I'm doing that, I'd love for our panelists to take a look at the questions and identify the ones that they want to answer live. I'm not seeing any that have jumped to the top, but there's some quick, easy ones. One of the questions is, what does the number required by the population +1 mean? If a county has 2.2 districts worth of people, is the number required by the population +1, 3 or 4 districts? My understanding of that is that it would be 4 districts, because it would be 2.2. So, you know, add 1, 3.2. So you couldn't go past 4 is my understanding. If Pat sees something different there, I'd love him to jump in and answer. But I have been experimenting with this myself in drawing maps to see what, you know, how it constrains. And it's not a huge constraint, but it is a constraint. When you think of Montgomery County, it should have been 1 and a part of 1 for the congressional districts, and instead it was drawn as 5. So if it was 1, what it's required +1, 3 would have been the maximum that would have been allowed. So it is a constraint. It's not a huge constraint, and we don't really want to put a huge constraint on it. We want some constraint on it, and I think that's an appropriate one. Another question is a city, town, borough, township, or ward a community of interest? If you look at the way the criteria is prioritized, those things come first. So keeping those things intact comes first. But as Representative Thomas just said, there are places where there are communities that people just need to be able to say, hey, you know, my street belongs with those streets. I know folks in Centre County have been talking about the way that their townships are constructed, the way their school systems are constructed. It's really hard to see who should be with whom, and they would love just a chance to say, these communities need to be part together. One of the things that I always point to is the Susquehanna River. And to me, that I begged to have that part about the geographic boundaries in this bill, because there are places where the Susquehanna River is a hard stop. There should not be a senatorial district that crosses from Lebanon County down into York. That's just wrong, because at that point the river is wide and there's a great divide between the people in Lebanon County and the people in York. But go north on the Susquehanna River, and then you have those river communities who are, in a sense, much more a community than they are with the ridges and the mountains surrounding them. So those communities ought to be able to say, here, the river towns are a community. There, the river is a hard stop geographical border. So those are, I think, really important issues that communities need to be able to weigh on. And I have to say, in mapping myself, in mapping Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, I would love to hear from neighborhoods that I know. I have spent a lot of time in Philadelphia. I know that there are neighborhoods that are very, very cohesive. And I look at those neighborhoods and the way they're just cracked into pieces. Those people lose representation when they can't talk to their neighbors about who they're voting for. And those are the places where we really want communities to say, Kensington is a neighborhood. It needs to vote as a neighborhood. It should not be divided up. Those are the kinds of communities of interest that we're looking for. And we will talk on our next call, our next meeting, about the platform that Aaron mentioned, Representable, because that allows people to go online and to kind of identify their communities, and then they can be layered on top of each other. So you can see a lot of people say this is a community, and this one looks really squirrely. Somebody's playing games here. It's a tool that could be used in that way. So I'm going to pause and see if our panelists have seen questions that they want to answer, or Representative Thomas, if you want to leap in and say something, you're welcome to do that. We have a few minutes to answer questions. I know we're not going to get to all of them, but let's go ahead and have a few more people answer questions.
I will defer to your other panelists. I'm just figuring out how to find the questions. Sorry.
Okay, Carol, this is Pat. I can jump in on a question about the hearings. There was a question: are there hearings after the maps are produced? And the answer is that they are both before and after. So the Legislative Reapportionment Commission would have to hold hearings. I believe we said 4 hearings, and also the committees, House and Senate state government committees, would hold hearings prior to releasing a preliminary plan, and then they would also have hearings after. In the case of the state legislative districts, Constitution says that anybody can file exceptions to the preliminary plan. And then there's a short time frame between the exceptions being filed and the commission producing the final plan. And so we squeezed 2 hearings in during that short time frame rather than 4 hearings, which would be required for the congressional maps after the preliminary plan is produced.
Hey, Carol, let me jump in. There was one question. Well, one person asked how to get their hands on the Redistricting Reform Commission report, and somebody helpfully filled in that link. So if you want to relive it in all its glory, the link is there. But then there was another question about how I felt, and maybe by proxy, the commission would feel about the what and the how features that are embedded in LACRA, and I would say they're very consistent with the ideas and that we heard about on our tour, and so we're quite comfortable those. I think Pat first shared that with me and folks at the Committee of 70. I don't know, it was some months ago. So we've seen those a number of times. And I was actually rereading the commission report today, and I came across some language. I think it was around sort of minority representation, and I thought, that sounds awfully familiar. And I think it's pretty close, if not exactly the same language that is in the LACRA legislation that Pat and Carol drafted. So we're all good with it.
I think Aaron's got a bunch of questions he's planning to answer. So Aaron, please go ahead.
Sure. So the first one is from Duncan McLean about so apparently local officials thought that the commission bills were too complicated and cumbersome, and that LACRA is even more detailed, and how should everyone respond? I don't know if I will respond to that one, but more to, are there any other states that have similar criteria? But in terms of being more detailed, I think explaining what criteria to follow isn't too detailed when compared to creating an entire commission. And I think a lot of the detail is the data transparency part, which won't even be handled by local officials. It will be handled by the LDPC. So I think those are some ways that you might be able to respond. Pat might have other thoughts because I think he knows more about the Pennsylvania legislature than I do. But in terms of other states that have similar criteria in place, there are a whole number of places that have similar criteria. Virginia passed a similar bill this past year. California's commission follows similar criteria. We actually submitted some sample legislation based on LACRA to Massachusetts. So there, hopefully there will be some up there. And those are just ones off the top of my head. There's, if you look on NCSL's website, they have a redistricting criteria page that lists all of the criteria in every state. So you can definitely see all of that. And then let me scroll through because I don't remember which other questions I said I was going to answer. So let's see. In terms of flooding the process with non-serious maps, I know that the California Commission got 20,000 public comments. And I've heard that they said that they had a pretty easy time digging through and figuring out which ones were nonsense and which ones weren't. So I think the line drawers themselves can kind of see that. I recognize that they might have not be as in good faith, but I think they'll see through that as well. And all of the public input, the fact that the citizen submitted maps have to be put up on the website with adequate time for the public to review them, means that the public themselves can look at it and be like, this is nonsense. And I think there were some about communities of interest.
Let me jump in and then you can scroll
Absolutely.
through and look for the other ones that you want to talk to. There are some questions about advocacy, and let me just say, we're not going to address advocacy questions today. This is kind of the bill and a little bit of the thinking behind the bill. Next week at 7 o'clock, we have an advocacy training event, and we will dig deep into advocacy, and that it will start out with a presentation on the team approach to advocacy, and then there will be lots of Q&A on how do we respond, what kind of resources do we have, what's the plan, what's the strategy. So next week, if you have advocacy questions, that'll be the place to come. Although I will talk a little bit about that on my regular monthly conference call tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, and I think you all got the number for that in the email that you received today. So I will talk a little bit about that. One of the questions was, have we tested the idea that maps can be drawn that don't divide counties but still meet the population requirement? There are times when counties have to be divided. There's no possibility that you can draw congressional or Senate or House maps that don't divide counties. The question is, are some counties bearing the brunt of that, or are counties being divided in ways that really don't make sense? Or are communities being splintered? And there are counties where there's more trees than people. So there are places where nobody cares if you divide it there. There are counties where there are very definite communities in parts of it. Think of Montgomery County. It's a very large county. It could not possibly be one congressional district. It has to be divided into at least two. But there are lots of different kinds of communities in Montgomery County. So that the point is that you can't draw the maps without dividing counties, and certainly for House districts, you've got to do a lot of dividing. Those are small, so counties do need to be divided. The question is, are you trying to keep things intact and using that as a metric when you go to do that, or are you ignoring that completely? I was going to show, and I might at the end just show Dave's redistricting. I don't think I'll show it, but I will mention it. Dave's redistricting app has been adding lots of really interesting metrics. And one of the metrics they have is to say how many divisions would be predicted if you were just simply drawing, draw a lot of maps for the PA House. You're likely to have a certain number of divisions. And it can tell you, is this map way beyond that? Or is this map even with that? Or is this map below that? So for instance, the slide I was going to share about our House maps, it has 26 divided precincts. There should be none, or it should be, a certain number of divisions. It's way above that. So there are metrics to show you your divisions of counties are out of line, or they're pretty much where they need to be mathematically speaking. So that's a helpful metric, and we'll look more closely at some of those metrics the next time when we meet again in 2 weeks to look at mapping and metrics. So Aaron, I think you have a few others that you're going to.
Yep. So it was 2 by Anne, and they keep skipping around on my screen. So they're both about communities of interest and like bad faith efforts to use communities of interest. And in particular, she mentions that Speaker Turzai, in the second half of the article that I don't agree with, wrote about like using cores of districts and how legislators are the ones who understand what communities of interest are, which I'm pretty sure the communities have a better idea of where they are than the legislator does, even if they've represented them for a decade. So that's one way that I would respond to that. And also, as I said, just the wealth of public input is going to be really important here. Like if 2 people from community stand up and say that they're community, then that might not be enough. But if 50, 100, 200 people all say this is our community, you get that aggregate agreement as to where the community is. You're going to be able to push back against bad faith communities of interest. And I think also the fact that we specifically state that a community is not one shared a shared relationship with a party, incumbent, or candidate will go a long way to preventing those kind of bad faith arguments as well, and using representable.
Does anybody else have a question that they want to jump in and answer?
Hey, Carol, I have a question I just want to repeat that I don't think has been answered. There were a couple comments asking, I think, maybe the Princeton folks to explain how the county, the sort of +1 requirement works, or not requirement, but the +1 criteria that you, so maybe Aaron or someone, you could take a crack at that.
Sure, I think Carol spoke to that a little bit in terms of like if a county is 2.2, +1 is 3.2, so you can only do 4 county splits. So I think that's mainly what that means. I don't know if Baxter or Hope want to hop in with anything about how it would work with mapping.
Well, this is Pat. I can jump in on that. I mean, both the way you answered it and the way Carol answered it before are correct. At least that is what is intended. We have heard from some people along the way over the last couple of years that they don't like the way it's phrased, that maybe it could be more accurately phrased than the way it is, but that is the intent. So if the example is 2.2 districts, then you go to 3 and then it's +1 more.
Yeah, I'm going to screen share for just a minute because I do want to show you. I was thinking maybe I wouldn't show you, but I think it might be helpful to see. So Representable has built a platform where people can begin to show what they believe to be their communities. And so an organization like Fair Districts PA can encourage all of our folks to kind of go on there. And I would say this is something we're thinking about that we would invite our local groups to begin to tackle together, to say, okay, Centre County, we've got lots of folks there. And this is an example from Michigan where Michigan, the Voters Not Politicians folks are looking at this as a tool for them to offer public comment for their citizen mapping commission. And so it's a way for citizens to look and say, yeah, here the community does bridge the river. This is what it would look like. In other places, it doesn't bridge the river. So I would have found this incredibly helpful myself in drawing my recent maps for the Draw the Lines competition. If I could look at Pittsburgh citizens offering their thoughts on what their communities were, it would be really helpful to tile those and to say, okay, that helps shape what these districts are. You still have the numeric requirements. And one of the conversations that I've had with the Representable folks, and I know others are thinking the same thing, is these communities are different. And when you're talking about a House district, if I was going to describe the communities that should be considered in my House district, that's very different than the communities that should be considered in my congressional district. I know Senator Scavello talks about considering the highways across the northern tier of Pennsylvania. He wants those considered in drawing congressional districts. I don't think you would want to consider those when you're drawing state House districts. It's a different kind of discussion. But this is a tool that is going to be considered, is going to be looked at. The other tool that I want to call your attention to, though, is on today's redistricting app. They now have all of the legislative maps for every state available for looking at. And so talking about divisions, they mention that 9 counties are split. in nine counties are split for House districts, even though they're smaller than a district. And they say what those are. Why was that done? That's a question. Given 203 districts, the expected number of county splits would be 202. The number for our current House map is 214. No precincts should be split, but 26 are. Those are the kind of metrics that when you have those available for maps that citizens submit, they can compare those against the maps that the legislators are drawing and saying, you know, we're curious why you have 26 precincts split. That's not necessary. Or we're curious why you have those counties split. We can draw it without splitting those counties. So those are interesting things. Another thing on Day's redistricting app, which is really worth looking at, is they now, just of today, I didn't see it when I was looking last weekend, they're posting maps that are top in specific areas. Now you can see the most proportional. I don't think we want our districts to look like that. You can see most competitive. We definitely don't want our districts to look like that. But when you look at the way the criteria is ranked in LACRA, the minority representation is ranked very high. Compactness is ranked very high. Least splits ranked high. So that one map that ended up for all three of those would certainly be a map that would be something to hold up against the legislator's map to say, can you do better than this? And if they can, that's great. But if they do worse, we can say, look, this meets the requirements of LACRA, and let's see what you can do. So another thing that's really interesting on Day's redistricting app is they are now offering analytics of specific maps on these different criteria. So the current PA House map, when you do a distribution of maps that they have available, proportionality is the worst. It's the bottom line. It's the basement. Competitiveness, it's like off the bottom. It's an outlier. Minority communities, it's actually very, very successable. Compactness, it's very unsuccessful. Splitting, it's very unsuccessful. So you can see that our PA House did prioritize keeping majority minority communities intact, and there's a reason, because that can be litigated, and those are the lawsuits that are won regularly. So they did pay attention to that. The other ones they did not pay attention to, and what we're saying is, let's make sure that they pay attention to all of these, but in a ranked criteria methodology. And just one last slide to show you, and then I think we will be running out of time. They also allow you to measure one map against another. So the olive map, the olive pentagon is the current PA House map, and it does very badly in competitiveness. It does pretty badly in everything except minority districts. The other one is the one that I just submitted for the Pennsylvania House, and you can see I did better on compactness because that's a priority with LACRA. So I took the criteria of LACRA and applied it in drawing a map to say, okay, minimize splits, maximize compactness, and once those are done, and make sure that you have as many majority minority districts as possible without drawing crazy maps. So those three kind of controlled the original work. And then I went back and said, is there a way to make it a bit more proportional, a bit more competitive? And that's what I came up with. So once you begin to look at maps like this, the maps that are outliers, the maps that are drawn for partisan reasons, you can see them. It's very obvious. You can simply look at a graphic like this and say, yeah, forget that. It's not better than the current one. It's not good. But I'm sure there are going to be mappers. And as David mentioned, the citizen mappers, I'm going to challenge them to beat me. And what we're going to want is for maps that really do, respect minority communities, respect compactness, and minimize splits, and then do better for proportionality as well. That would be really impressive to see. And I think that as we invite communities to weigh in on this, we can get there.